Welcome to Kindred, hosted by me, Kate, and my sister, Jen. In this podcast, we explore our human relationship to the natural world. In connecting to this planet, we also connect to understanding, compassion, and empathy. How can we see ourselves as not separate or above animals in nature, but a critical and integrated part of an active ecosystem? Through conversations with animal advocates, scientists, conservationists, and many others, we look to inspire a new awareness of how and why we connect to animals and nature in order to repair and restore our relationship to the natural world. Hey everyone, welcome to Kindred. Welcome, sister and co-host. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing? Yeah.
I'm good. Very excited for this episode, and we are just going to roll right into it today. We have a lot to cover, and it's a big conversation. So, without further ado, I'd like to first off invite you to follow us on Instagram at the Kindred Pod. We post all our episodes, relevant articles, sound bites, and it's a great space to dive deeper into our overall content and a space for you to interact with us, which we love. So follow us there. Please leave your comments, your quips, and your queries. Much like you, sister, right? So today we are speaking with Sloane Hawes, she, her, Chief of Research and Development at C.A.R.E, which stands for Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. So just a bit about C.A.R.E. It was founded in 2020, and C.A.R.E is America's first national Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, animal welfare organization. Their mission is C.A.R.E, in the interest of human and animal well-being, prioritizes and amplifies BIPOC and other marginalized voices using narratives, research, and community center investments. And just to give you a bit about our guest, Sloane, today, from their website, careawo.org. She is a scholar activist who is deeply committed to addressing inequities in human and animal well-being. She brings nearly a decade of social work and research experience to her role as the Chief of Research and Development at C.A.R.E. And Sloane's research interests include mutual aid, coalition building, One Health, Indigenous knowledge, cultural humility, trauma-informed care, decolonization, and restorative justice. So we are all about C.A.R.E and Miss Sloane. And I've been following C.A.R.E's work since they were founded by CEO James Evans, and we've wanted to talk with them about the work they are doing in context to animal welfare and the BIPOC communities ever since. And Sloane and the work C.A.R.E are doing are leaders in this field and unique in the intersections they amplify and work within. A great conversation, an incredible organization. I'm very much honored and excited to be able to work with them, and the fact that they're willing to come on and talk with us is just huge to us. So, a lot to cover, right, sister?
Yes, it indeed, a lot to cover. A big topic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much to Sloane for taking on big questions with many layers, and we will see you at the takeaway. Sloane, thanks so much for joining us today. We are so grateful to have you here representing an absolutely incredible organization. So, Sloane, if you would, please introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again. My name is Sloane Hawes, pronoun she, her, and I am the Chief of Research and Development at C.A.R.E, or Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity.
Excellent. Well, again, we so appreciate you being here. We know you just got off a busy schedule, so thanks for jumping on with us out of Colorado, one of our favorite states. But just to start, if you would, give us a bit of history of C.A.R.E and why it was founded, and what is your overall mission?
Great. Yeah, so C.A.R.E came into the scene in 2020 is when we were founded as the first national BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Person of Color led organization in this interesting space of animal welfare and human well-being. And so prior to our founding, just to drop a few stats, I'm a research nerd, so I'm going to kind of wind that in here as we go.
Let's do it.
But prior to our founding in 2020, we walked onto a landscape that looked like this. The veterinary medicine profession is hugely non-diverse. We've got 93% of veterinarians are white, with 2% of veterinarians being Black and less than 1% are Indigenous and Native American.
Wow.
The field of animal welfare is a tiny bit more diverse. So the broader field being kind of like the animal sheltering, animal protection, groomers, right? Like kind of just being a little more expansive in how we think about that beyond just veterinary medicine. Data that C.A.R.E has collected says that we have about 85% of people who identify as white and or women, right? So we came onto this landscape as C.A.R.E with that knowledge that this field is incredibly non-diverse. And yet our founder and CEO, current CEO, James Evans, who's an African-American man and has been in this industry for over 15 years, he has hands-on experience working with beautiful, amazing, talented, brilliant BIPOC individuals in this space, and had observed over time and had been contracted in various roles to essentially solve for this problem of how this very non-diverse industry can more effectively engage, if you will, with BIPOC folks. And that all of that was very coded language, essentially, of please, African-American man, come in and tell us how to speak with, quote unquote, your people. And so rather than sort of trying to support existing organizations who are led by white women to kind of figure this out, a funder essentially approached James back in 2020 or before 2020, the year before in 2019, to essentially solve this problem of, instead of recreating and trying to make white-led organizations less harmful towards BIPOC communities, I think it's well past due for us to have a BIPOC-led national organization that instead of teaching white-led orgs how to do this better, instead of trying to improve an already harmful system of animal welfare, let's create a new system based on the principles of human animal well-being and BIPOC lived experience. So our mission is really that. We are rethinking and rebuilding animal welfare in a way that honors and reflects the well-being of all people and their family members, including their pets. So we amplify marginalized voices through kind of three activities: through narrative, through research, which is my wheelhouse, and community-centered investments. And so we're really trying to find those solutions for sustainable change for human and animal well-being.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I really feel like I've been following C.A.R.E just via Instagram, basically. You have a really good, strong representation there. I really feel like you are leaders in this work. And I don't know of another organization that is doing this kind of work in this specific intersection, which is a word I'll use a few times through this interview, but it really is incredible. And like you said, just so past due time. So again, just so much a rounds of applause. But I just want to start now with, and apologies if this might seem obvious to some, but I think it's really important to get very clear when we are using acronyms. And in this conversation, BIPOC. I know this term means, like you said, Black and Indigenous people of color, a term of solidarity, but I also know that there's a lot of history and a lot of representation here. Not all experiences are the same just because you're a person of color, right? So from the C.A.R.E perspective, who are we talking about? This big question. What is the history of inclusion, equity, and animal welfare within the BIPOC community, specifically in context to U.S. history?
Yeah, that is a huge question. So I'm going to do my best here. And I think it's also important because the listeners are literally listening. They're not seeing me. And just to kind of give a description of myself, I am a white person who identifies as a woman. I'm able-bodied. And so I don't identify as BIPOC. That said, a majority of the staff and folks who work at C.A.R.E are BIPOC, including our leadership, and all of the communities that we work with. We are prioritizing working with BIPOC communities, but also just more broadly, communities experiencing marginalization, right? And so when we talk about there being a lot of history and a lot of representation around these issues of discrimination, there are all types of different isms that we're talking about. We're talking about racism, we're talking about classism, we're talking about ableism, we're talking about sexism, right? We are a country that unfortunately, historically and also present day, have a variety of different forms of discrimination that are showing up in all of our various industries and institutions. They're on this massive systemic level, and then they trickle down to individuals and their attitudes and their behaviors. And so really, when we're talking about sort of why does C.A.R.E focus on BIPOC folks, I think it's really important to say up front, C.A.R.E is not here to say being white is bad. That is not the purpose of our programming or our activities, is to, basically evoke, sort of white woman tears. Like, that's not what we're here for.
Right.
We're here filling a critical need in the space for representation of BIPOC folks, their narratives, and what they want and what they need for their own communities, right? So we are being very intentional around carving out this space that has not been touched by other animal welfare organizations to date, because that representation has been lacking. You'll hear me say a few times as I talk about our work, these two words around community-specific priorities and community-led solutions. And those are two things that, from a research perspective, are really intentional about in the broad landscape of all the efforts anybody has ever made in the history of ever to solve these big, huge problems.
Right.
Over and over and over again, what we have found is that these community-specific interventions and these community-led ones are the ones that are most sustainable. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that ties into this question around the acronym of BIPOC and who are we talking about and what are the types of programming and solutions that we're putting into place and amplifying through our work. And the real kind of root of it is this idea that each group has different circumstances that brought them to where they are. And we can't be effective in our work if we're not distinguishing their experiences and really listening hard and checking ourselves at what we think the solution is. So, it's this idea of like programs that are going to address survivors of genocide, Native American folks, right? That the programs that are going to support that specific population are going to be very different from people who survived slavery and Jim Crow, right?
Exactly. One size does not fit all.
So blurring these together is not effective. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I think that's just really important to say. And then how does this sort of intersect with animal welfare in the BIPOC community?
Yeah. So what the data shows is we are still experiencing issues of discrimination, racial discrimination. I'll just narrow in on that in particular today. So we've got data from two really well-respected institutions, from C.A.R.E, the Human Bond Research Institute, and Petco Love, a really big adoption promotion organization. They provide a majority of our pet products, right? That this issue of racial discrimination is showing up in multiple areas of our industry. So in pet adoptions, when adopting a pet, Black pet owners are more likely to experience discrimination in pet adoption. In veterinary medicine, 1 in 5 pet owners of color have had a negative experience when visiting a veterinarian. And Black and Latinx pet owners were more likely to experience that discrimination. And in pet stores, Black pet owners are more likely to have negative experiences at pet supply stores, right? So anybody who's trying to say at this point that discrimination and racism doesn't still exist, and it, in general, just the data doesn't support that claim.
Right.
And then we have data now finally in 2022 showing how that's persisting in the animal welfare space.
And that's why the research is so critical. And that's why having that objective research sort of perspective and looking from the scientific space is really critical here.
Yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
and I think the thing, like you said before, if it exists on a broad level, it's going to trickle down to the particulars. And it is great to actually have data to back that up rather than just, it makes complete sense. And I think we all kind of know it, but to actually have the hard numbers is nobody can actually deny that when you have those numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially when you kind of take it into this sort of very personal, very heart space, when you have an animal that's ill and you're walking into your vet and you're having these experiences and there's these issues, and we'll get into that later, but this is a very real, very active experience for people. So thank you for breaking that down. That's great. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that before we move on, Sloane?
No, we'll get into it as we go here.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I had used the term intersection before, and I want to get back to that. So I wanted to now meet at an intersection that C.A.R.E works within, and that intersection is one that meets at 3 key spaces: animal welfare, social justice, and ecological or environmental justice. I'd also like to center this in the idea that, or this quote, that if you can't afford a pet or its vet bills, you shouldn't have a pet. If you would please center this perspective in this intersection of animal welfare, social justice, and environmental justice, and break down why this narrative is problematic.
Yeah, there is so much here. I think I'll speak first to that intersection of our work, essentially sort of why has C.A.R.E strategically positioned ourselves at this intersection, not just of animal welfare, but again, of the human stuff, the social justice issues, and also the environmental stuff, which we haven't touched on yet, the environmental justice space.
Yeah.
And it's really this coming from this place of recognizing that, again, those very large isms, the classism, the racism, the ageism, the ableism, those are really complex social problems that I was trained as a social worker, and and social workers are kind of one of those frontline disciplines, if you will, that are really focused specifically on social problems. And one of the basic tenets of social work practice is that these issues all have manifestations on what we say is like a macro, a meso, and a micro level, right? So like macro being like the big global level, meso being kind of this community level, and then micro being that individual family level. And our basic training says, regardless of which level of practice you're engaging in, you have to be looking at things through that lens of, say you're a clinician and you're a therapist working on a one-on-one level. In animal welfare, right, we've got a lot of folks working at that one-on-one level of how can we get this one pet rehomed somewhere else, but ideally moving forward, we're looking at how can we keep this one pet with the family that it's with currently.
Right.
And that has been where animal welfare has historically focused, is at that individual level of just the animal, right? We've had a lot of folks come to the profession saying like, oh, I want to be in animal welfare because I don't like people, right? I want to work with people. But
exactly.
what they have critically missed in that.
It's funny, I've never had that thought before, LOL. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
you
right?
can't
It
really
happens
extricate it. Yeah, you can't really do that, can you?
All the time.
Right.
Yeah. And on the social work side, we have, I got a lot of criticism early in my education when I started leaning in this kind of human animal interaction space, because it was like, we have enough people problems. Why are you focusing on animal stuff? And, the critical thing that was missed is all of these animal issues are people issues.
Right. You can't separate the two.
Impact animals as well. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can't
so
separate
that's a very tiny sprout of what came, like this intentionality around not just focusing on humans and animals, but also the environment, right? We know that the environmental, again, from a research perspective, we know the environment that people come up in greatly impacts their health, right? There's a framework in public health, the social determinants of health, and there are things like housing, they're like built environment, do you have access to green space? There's a whole set of criteria that go beyond just you as a human and your family and what you have, it's what you have access to, it's where you come from.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's so complicated. And these are such massive issues that
I know
you have bitten off a lot, I have to say. Congratulations, well done.
And it's like she said, it's so far behind time. I think that's why it's so epically huge.
It's epically huge, and at the same time, I also, and maybe this is just my research brain, where you just kind of have to focus on, and not one issue at a time, but you have to focus on really bring that community specific and community led framework in that C.A.R.E kind of prioritizes. You've got to focus on one place at a time.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
And that's why you're good at your job, because what you're just like, no, I'm not going to listen to all the noise. I'm just going to focus, take one bite at a time, and we're going to get there. And you just keep your mission in the forefront of your brain, and then you can do it. And that's where brains like yours are really, really valuable too. So
very
great.
Yeah, and so I think that's where this this narrative around if you can't afford a pet or it's vet bills, you shouldn't have a pet.
Right.
It's a really great place to take this conversation, because I think it's a really good example of how we focused again on we focus on individual problems, right? We focus on that one person's ability to have access to enough finances to keep that pet. And then we have done away with all of the other factors that inform whether or not that pet ownership relationship is going to go well, right? So on the individual level, it discounts the love that is present in that relationship, right?
Absolutely.
On a kind of a community level, it discounts whether or not there's even a veterinarian in their area, right? I live in rural Colorado, and I've got one option for a veterinarian. Okay? I won't say who they are, but they're not affordable, and it takes me weeks to get into the vet. Or if I have an emergency case, I've got to pay, you know, an extra charge to get an emergency drop off or an emergency appointment.
Oh, tell me about it.
It's a huge problem. And then on a global macro level, we've been collecting data and kind of analyzing it in terms of what this veterinary shortage. The latest number is that there is one veterinarian for every 22,000 animals in the US, right?
Is that right?
The basic math.
Goodness.
Yeah, if you take the total numbers of pets in the US, the estimation is about 66% of households have pets, and the number of veterinarians that we know exist, it's one for every 22,000 animals, right?
That's ridiculous.
So just that basic statement of I'm going to blame this individual for not being able to afford pet care just totally discounts all those other broader systemic issues that might be at play.
Wow.
Well, and I just want to add too, and this is nothing against veterinary medicine. It's extremely expensive. The vet bills are so high. I don't know. Affording it is, again, so relative. Like, what does that actually mean? And if you're looking at like communities, it's sort of like, so does that mean a whole entire low income neighborhood doesn't get to have like a dog or a cat or a fish or a hamster? Like, what are we talking about here, right?
Well, and also it's kind of absurd to say if you can't afford the vet bills, because nobody has a crystal ball to be able to be like, okay, I'm going to have $10,000. I mean, you don't know what you're going to need. Some pets are very, very inexpensive to have, and when emergencies happen, there's no way to prepare for that. You know what I'm saying? It's just kind of ridiculous.
No, it's 100%. I mean, basically, there's this idea. I'm into kind of housing issues was one of the topics that I was focusing on before I came into this animal welfare space. And so I think housing is another really great example of like just the basic cost of keeping your housing. Most folks live, you know, at probably the 50% of your income, if not more, is going towards housing. And the official designation or the official kind of goal for cost burden, it's a concept that they use to measure like how expensive is housing. You know, a majority of the US is living above that kind of acceptable range of the cost burden of what it costs for you to just maintain your housing, right? We're just talking about basic needs. We're not even talking about medical care, which I would argue is still a basic need, right? But a house is the first step, right?
Right.
And so, and housing is impacting the animal issues too, right? So there, we as a society have sort of capitalized around housing, and we have this landscape where we have tenants and we have landlords who are charging tenants exorbitant fees just to have their family together, their pets, who are members of their family living there with them. And so it's really interesting, I guess is what I would say, to see how we put pets into this subcategory of like a luxury. And what we know from, again, kind of pulling in historical context is that, you know, there are systems that are in place that allow some folks to have access to these quote unquote luxuries while others do not. But the benefits of having a pet around like cardiovascular health and social isolation. And there's a ton of data about how a pet impacts. And my kind of interesting entree into this field was around like how can pets be sort of a more sustainable and less resource intensive approach for supporting health outcomes than our medical system that is also quite expensive, right, to maintain.
No, exactly. Right. Yeah.
So it's like, it's like we're like preventing people from having pets because they can't afford them, but then we're putting the cost of them not having pets back on the system when folks have to come to the ER to get those things addressed, right? If they just have a pet, the dollars and cents argument starts not to add up.
But I feel like there's got to be studies out there showing that as far as like emotional intelligence and even just like learning how to get along in life is better with pets, I feel like.
Yeah, 100%. I think the research is still kind of in its early stages. It's still quite, there are some really good solid studies, like those things I studied around like cardiovascular health and social isolation. Those are reaching that point where they are, very accepted, they're generalized. What I'll say though, is that a lot of that research, like most research, really has a very huge underrepresentation of BIPOC communities issue.
Fair enough.
Right. So all of that data is coming from, big national samples, or they're folks who are accessing the healthcare system who agree to participate in these bigger longitudinal studies. And so one of the things that I specifically here at C.A.R.E as Chief of Research and Development am focused on is I'm advising and I'm supporting these national organizations or these human focus organizations or these mostly animal focus organizations to really think about their strategies for how are you including BIPOC folks in your surveys and in your understanding of your program.
Right. Yes.
It's a big gap.
Big gap. Absolutely. Yeah. And, I just want to bring it back to the animal welfare sort of perspective too, is we hear all the time, hey, everybody, the shelters are full. The shelters are full. Go to the shelters, adopt, don't shop, go to the shelters. And then if you then are BIPOC and you go to the shelter and you get discriminated against, it's like this whole thing of like all these false narratives. How does that actually then ultimately affect animal welfare? I mean, the animals are ultimately suffering, right? This is so conjoined.
Yeah, it totally is. I mean, so a really small example. So, we have these definitions of what a quote unquote responsible pet owner is, and they are fraught with, sort of these sort of white middle class ideals of like, for example, one of the more widely respected definitions of the human bond has items like, I would, my pet sleeps in my bed. I would pay for my pet's veterinary care no matter what it costs, right? Like there's a lot of these, it's a 14 item, scale, if you will, that scores somebody's human bond. And like over half of them have this skew towards white middle class folks. So if a person living in a community with lower socioeconomic status and is impacted by all these social determinants of health, like a veterinary care shortage in their area, they're going to get like a 50% on that bond score, and they're going to be told they're not good enough to own a pet.
Right, not a good enough candidate.
And so,
right.
And so that has shown up in our shelter policy, right? So our adoption processes, historically speaking, there are questions like, do you have a fenced-in yard? Do you own your home? Do you have any kids? All these things that are like just sort of arbitrary barriers, if you will. And so we've created, in some ways, not be very popular, but like the animal shelters in a lot of ways have constructed their own problem around euthanasia by creating barriers for a number of people in society, but in particular BIPOC and low socioeconomic status folks to have access to adopting pets out of their shelter. So some of C.A.R.E's early work was really around that issue of adoption discrimination and how can we remove barriers to adoption. And the stories are coming out of what happens when you remove barriers. And it's like, oh, wait, our length of stay is going down. Oh, wait, our euthanasia numbers are going down, right? Like all of these critical success factors for animal shelters improve when they become more inclusive and they break down these barriers. So the data is, just kind of tying it all up in a bow over and over again. It is saying the more inclusive, the more equitable we as an industry around animal welfare are, the better the outcomes, not only for our organizations, the dollars and cents math works out, gets better in our communities, the health of the people, but also the health of the animals, the shelters, the overpopulation issues go down. I mean, I just think the writing is on the wall from a data perspective. The equity and human bond and inclusivity, like we that's where we need to be.
Yeah, and I'm going to open this tiny can of worms. We can't spend too much time on this, but I'm going to bring up pit bulls, the sweet baby nanny dogs. And they're such a fantastic example of this. Can you just talk about that for just a minute? Timer's on.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great example of, again, kind of tying back into this intersection space that C.A.R.E is working of social justice, animal welfare, and environmental justice. I think the pit bull type dog advocacy issue is a great example where we as an animal welfare field have failed to align with other movements that are already working on these issues. So pit bull type dogs has become, there's a lot of different ways that this discrimination against this breed shows up, but one of the biggest ways is in housing, where we've got breed bans and restrictions around types of breeds that are allowed in housing. And one of the really, really small ideas I'd like to plant here today, and that C.A.R.E is really advocating for, is instead of spending millions of dollars around advocating for breed-specific legislation, let's align our efforts and our resources toward basic tenant right protections that prohibit people from discriminating against anyone around housing, including their pets, as opposed to spending hundreds of millions of dollars on just the tiny little slice of that discrimination issue that impacts one species or one breed of dog. And so it's not to say that the lives of those dogs don't matter, that they are not worth advocating for in their own unique, breed specific ways. But there is this kind of bigger picture perspective that if we're spending our resources and aligning with the social justice movement, which a lot of orgs see as mission drift currently, and we're hoping that will change with some of this advocacy that C.A.R.E is doing, if folks can align with the social justice movement and then this broader environmental justice movement as well, a lot of those quote unquote smaller issues like breed specific legislation will get addressed in the process.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, well, sorry.
No,
do
you
mean like being able to have a pet at all in housing? Is that what you're talking about? Or
yeah, so so
because I was going to ask you about
of that. Kind of taking, so currently, right, we have a big focus on advocating for repealing breed specific legislation, right, which prohibits folks from having pit bulls in their housing. If people can't have their dogs in their house, the dog goes to the shelter, right? And then the dog gets euthanized because they can't find a new home for that dog because there's nowhere that dog can live with a person. Instead of spending, all these resources on trying to fix that sort of smallish, it's quite big, but smallish.
I know what you mean.
Problem. How about we address discrimination against all forms of people, which is a bigger issue, right?
Yeah,
exactly. If we take the money, and there's a lot more players in that space, right, than just the animal welfare advocates.
Yeah,
it's a better use of resources.
So I want to shift gears a little bit now, Sloane, and I wanted to talk about the DEI fatigue, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion fatigue. And I want to juxtapose DEI fatigue with education. I think these things are super connected because if a person is growing up in a society that demands that they have to prove themselves and are always having to work so hard to create a place for themselves in a space that holds false narratives of you historically and institutionally, that is exhausting. And it brings up the question, also, who are we needing to educate and in what systems and institutions? So another big question, but if you could break down for us what DEI is and what role education can play in elevating narratives that society can hold of the BIPOC community, and of course, especially in context to animal welfare and rights.
Yeah. So I think kind of starting off, just to be clear, C.A.R.E doesn't see themselves as a DEI organization, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The acronym that we use for our work and for our certificates is REDI, so racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that might seem like semantics, but it's actually a really important shift to recognize what is the issue that DEI is trying to solve. And it's essentially what is the first letter, right? That's the priority. So the US doesn't have a diversity problem, right? We're almost about 50-50 split in terms of racial ethnic demographics here in the US. So the diversity problem is not kind of the priority at C.A.R.E. The priority is how do you take the beautiful diversity we have in the US right now and get to a place where everyone has equitable access to opportunity and health outcomes that are positive for themselves and for their pets. So C.A.R.E is really engaging from this place of like really challenging the DEI field to focus on what the priority is, which we believe is racial equity. So we're not the only groups talking about it in that way, but in the animal welfare space, we believe it's particularly important to not spend all this time just on diversity, but really shift towards where the end goal is, right, which is equity. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of a really good example of where this DEI fatigue, if you will, is coming from. Is it's a lot of semantics. It's a lot of like, are you walking? Are you talking the talk, right? Do you know what the latest vocabulary is? Are you introducing yourself with your pronouns and giving yourself a description of kind of all your positionality when you're sharing out your stuff at a conference, right? Like I modeled that at the start of this and part of my introduction, right? So there's a lot of fatigue coming from the like, as a white person, like trying to stay up to date with the latest conversation around terminology. And what I'll say is DEI is not a toolkit. It cannot be a toolkit. It cannot be a list of things that you memorize. It's not a list of a do's and a don'ts. It's equity, right? It's how do we get to a place where all of these big, huge social problems have been resolved and have been sustainably addressed. And so, I think from my perspective as a researcher, a lot of this fatigue is coming from that, this kind of trying to focus on just like, it's a toolkit of something I need to memorize, and the toolkit keeps changing and it's very hard to stay up to date. And part of the reason that's so hard to stay up to date on, or I guess a way it would be easier, is if instead of looking to a toolkit to tell you how to do this, if you actually did the work of equity, which is being in relationship, in conversation, in partnership with the communities disproportionately impacted, like BIPOC communities, like other marginalized communities. And so there's a real, that essentially hasn't happened because there's this also broader landscape of denial of basic science, of basic data that show these disparities exist, right? I already stated, like in animal welfare specifically, our three biggest areas of adoption, veterinary medicine, and pet products, there are disparities that exist in terms of Black and other persons of color's experience in this industry. And so there's this real big denial that is driving a lot of that fatigue behind folks who have dedicated their careers to this, or in C.A.R.E's case, like our organization name is Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity, right? There's like no denying that we are part of this space, but we are trying to be out in front of being an organization that's not being, there's actually this term coming up of like equity tourists, like because of this movement around DEI that has happened, it's been happening a lot longer than since 2020, right?
For
but
sure.
There was a resurgence with the murder of George Floyd in 2020. That we're not just folks that are kind of riding this wave that is, responsible for what this, kind of equity tourism piece is pointing out, is like people are kind of helicoptering in, if you will, to like kind of do one research project from this equity lens, or maybe they're, like trying to partner with one BIPOC-led organization, but they're not really partnering with them. They are doing it in a way that's kind of perpetuating these power dynamics, and they're actually taking resources away from the organizations who are really trying to do this work, and they're here to stay, right? They're not there to be tourists. They are members of the community already, and And so there's this real big broader issue that's feeding into that fatigue concept of like, there's a lot of people talking the talk of DEI because there's a ton of toolkits out there, but there's not a lot of people really walking the walk and are like actually in proximity with the community and the folks that we at C.A.R.E are working with. I think it's another piece that's like really important in terms of how do we achieve like actual change on these issues. So if we want to focus on the education system, right? White folks, we have this really bad problem of like, we think when we talk about something that means like we've done something. Like we think if we have a book club about it, like, oh, I just read Just Action last week, so now I know everything there is to know about housing policy and discrimination and how to address it. Like we treat that as kind of a checkbox.
Right. We pat ourselves on the back.
Oh yeah, totally. We're like, super. I talked about it with my friends, so therefore I can move forward. There's this real need to move into action, right? So like we've got really amazing racial equity scholars like Ibrahim X. Kendi, who talks about like, we can't just stop with changing minds. Like we have to change hearts. but then we also have to change our hands, right? Like we have to change what we do. We have to change where we vote. We have to change where we live. We have to change, all these pieces. It's like real action oriented. So it's something in my research that I really reflect on a daily basis and actively am requesting feedback on. It's part of how we select the approach for how we do this research in a really participatory way with our communities. It's not just about, talking about the issues and documenting them. It's about actually taking that research and put it into action. So, here at C.A.R.E, we are scholar activists, right? We're not just scholars who write the papers and send them off to the peer-reviewed journals and call it done.
Yes.
We're doing something about it.
Implementing programs, getting into you are working your way into the institutions. And this is where I find this work so incredible. And, this may be a little bit of a side sort of coming away from this part of the conversation, but I don't think so, because I'm hearing echoes of generational trauma here, and also in context to animal welfare. And I can't relate in terms of as a white woman. I can relate in terms of being a woman. And if you Google, like, how am I classified? It says subordinate or disadvantaged is where I'm placed. But I'm hearing echoes of generational trauma in here too. Is that true? Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I mean, generational trauma is a really big idea, but breaking it down, it's essentially what we've been talking about this whole time, of the ways historical policy has shaped where we're at today. And I think what the data shows is that, again, even though we want to treat everyone as an individual, that like what has happened to them in this lifetime, in this, in this recent period of time, that's what we are accountable for. I think that's where a lot of this kind of, white woman tears, kind of shame feelings come from most of us who are white, trying to figure out how to navigate this space and to be a good ally, to be someone who's doing this work, advancing social justice and advancing racial equity. It's coming from this place of like, well, I wasn't around, when a lot of this harm happened. And generational trauma really brings actual data to the conversation about, what happened multiple generations ago is impacting people today.
Yes,
on a biological level, right? Like stress is documented, like it changes folks' DNA.
Right.
And then those policies are still persisting, right? Like the discriminatory housing stuff that happened back in the 60s, it is still shaping where people live and what things they have access to, right? That social determinants of health concept. So there are ways that this generational trauma, that maybe it happened 3 generations ago, 2 generations ago, it's literally still showing up in folks on a biological basis, a social basis, a societal basis today. And so it really shifts into that mindset of like, or I guess how I would say is how I approach it, is really from this place of like also recognizing that some of our biggest civil rights movements, they need white folks in them to be successful, right? So without significant white participation in like our civil rights movement, for example, the BIPOC communities and the civil rights organizers, they need access to the white, political, financial support that can make that impact happen.
But that's like the white person standing next to or behind, not always in front of the BIPOC person behind you. Say, I'll explain for you, and moving forward. And this really does but this also comes back to I can think of how animal welfare has been so deeply impacted in the BIPOC community because of this generational, these perspectives and these ways that have been going on for a long time. But yes,
I mean, it's across the board though. Like I was in child welfare for a little while there too, and just the same thing, like just learning about the history of, taking the savage out of the child, and they strip the Native Americans of their culture, their language, their dress, they cut their hair, and then the white women came in with their capes on. We are saving the day, and I had a little bit of that feeling of you can only change things if you know about it, and I can't change that I'm white, and middle age and whatever else. But I can be aware of how I move through the space. You know what I'm saying? So that's, I think what you're saying is true. We're not saying, hey, all white people out, but just like check yourself at the door, educate yourself,
please.
Realize what has been going on for way, way, way too long, and let's look with different lens.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Let's throw truth, and we can be an advocate and maybe even a disruptor. This is what we can do. This is what we can do. I don't need to apologize for being white, super, super white, and middle-aged. I don't have to apologize for that. What I do need to do is take these actions on these levels and change this and hand over and get behind. Is there anything you want to finish up with that, Sloane? Because I'm going to move on.
I think there's a few things on again, how does this show up in animal welfare that I can elaborate on a little bit, right? So we've talked a little bit about this kind of definition of responsible pet ownership. I think something you just said, Jen, brought this up of like, animal welfare has a serious white savior problem, right? Like we have codified in animal policy, and then also we talked about adoption policies, right? But it shows up in multiple ways that like what makes a responsible pet owner, and it's really interesting when you look at the broader data about the number of folks who have pets and their understanding of pets as a member of their family. Again, like that C.A.R.E and Petco data talks about how human-animal bond is experienced universally with strong bonds across all races and ethnicities. Yet animal welfare still feels this need to essentially like control or like contain or like gatekeep who has animals, right? Like who is the person who is most deserving of that love, of that bond. And like, oh yeah, I have to sign off on it that like you are good enough. And I think it's this broader issue too of like that we see kind of tying in the DEI fatigue question. And it's like not valuing or seeing people's own experiences as like valuable or worth having, right? It's like this broader societal issue that like some people are better than others, right? Like you bring in the child welfare example from your tribal communities. It's like there was this like actual belief that Native American folks, right? Folks living in tribal communities were not taking care of their children in a way that was adequate. And we literally removed those children from their home, put them in boarding schools, and
because we believe they would be better
they've
off.
ever known or loved. Yeah.
In our lifetime, what you were talking about, Jen, the US and Canadian governments abducting, stealing little babies from Native and Indigenous communities. That's happened since I was
not
born.
Very long ago. Right, exactly. In our lifetime.
This was 5 minutes ago. So,
right, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Well, Sloane, our last question is our question for everybody. Why is this such an overall critical conversation? What narratives are we changing? But also what new connections are we making in understanding how we all contribute to the BIPOC community in context to animal welfare?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the why question. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? And at C.A.R.E, love is the reason, right? We are a BIPOC-led organization that, are BIPOC people who have experienced this discrimination in their own lives and are now part of an organization, that has essentially decided like the buck stops with us, right? Mm-hmm. This is not trauma. This is not harm that we are passing on to future generations. We are going to ally with the other movements in social justice and environmental justice to put an end to these isms, especially to the extent that they show up in the animal welfare space and are impacting who benefits or who has the privilege, if you will, to have a pet as a member of their family. And so, our why is love. We want to strengthen these families. We want to cultivate that human-animal bond. And we want to address the systems and policies that are prohibiting and punishing folks for what that love looks like and how it plays out.
And, this is a human experience. this isn't a white, black, I don't think it's any of the external skin. This is a human experience. And because it is love, right? This is something we all have and we all share. And that's what animals care about. They don't care about where you're from, if you can afford the vet bills, what your history is, any of that. They don't care. And I think this is where I love that the mission is really love. I mean, I've never also heard an organization be like, oh, it's love. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, that was very powerful thing to say, actually. Pretty simple, but it was just like, oh, wow, it kind of smacked me in the face when you said that.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's really what it's about. It's not easy. It's complicated, but it's very simple at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I'll take it one step further to bring in that systems piece. I love this quote. Love is what justice looks like in public. And so, it's taking us one step further to say, like, what does that love look like in a broader context? It's, of course, an individual experience. It's, of course, white folks getting out of the way and checking ourselves of why do we feel a need to control and contain who has access to having pets.
Such a good question.
It's like a real deep humility exercise there. Like there's some self-work on an individual level needed to see why that's happening. And it's also a systemic issue of like, from a justice perspective, how do we address all these harms of generations and what's showing up with us here today?
Well, Sloane, thank you so much for joining us today. What a very large conversation. Thank you for taking on the biggest questions I think I've ever written. I appreciate your absolute effort, and just your research perspective is so critical for us to learn about, and we just so appreciate. Please follow C.A.R.E on Instagram, C.A.R.E for Equity. I think you've got such a fantastic representation there. I love your Instagram account. Of course, you can get on the website. Lots of information there too. Is there anywhere else we should be following or finding?
I think our social media is a great way to get to know us. Another thing is to donate, right? So talking about like what are some direct, tangible ways that you could support our organization. Our donations go directly to folks. We have a direct care fund that supports people and their pets, and essentially addressing this gap around access to veterinary care and folks that they can trust to take care of their family members. And so inviting folks to take one step further than just liking us and following us and sharing our posts, kind of put your money where your thoughts are after this podcast, if you will, or even better, engage in these conversations in your own local community. We are, most powerful at that community specific level. And so again, we've talked about a lot of really big problems here today, but our individual actions, they really do matter. And every person that you touch, touches 7 more people or something like that. There's some kind of data point around those degrees of separation. And not in a creepy way. I just said the word touch. I don't mean literally touch them.
Steady girl.
Every one person you impact has this broader connection.
Absolutely. And I will say, there was a beautiful video that you feature on your website, and it really highlights the interconnection and I think the specific video was in a Native community. It was very, very chilly. It's a beautiful sort of, it's a video and just like showing the interworkings and how the community is working and leading within their own community, which is really beautiful. So check out the website. Again, Sloane, thank you so much for your time. Again, please follow C.A.R.E, especially on Instagram. You will learn a lot, and the representation is fantastic. So thank you so much, and have a great day in Colorado today.
Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Takeaway. Ooh, girl, that was a lot to cover. My gosh, Sloane, you are like a rodeo rider. I mean, I don't even know. She was incredible. I'm not going to highlight each major topic. It's just too much. As far as like the amount that we covered, I think it was not even enough in the context. But I also want people to steep in their own highlights. And for me, this episode is one that I will definitely listen to again and again, and I'll get something out of it every time I listen.
Yeah. There's a lot to digest. To digest.
There really is.
It's just going to take time. I mean, I don't think it's people could listen to it one time, but I don't think you can really absorb it all in one time, because boy, she really covered a lot.
Well, and I think it's also because C.A.R.E so uniquely, I believe, the work they're doing is again, we talked about the intersections that they're putting together and working within is different, and that's what's really new with Sloane just sort of flipping things on their head, which I loved. So what I do want to talk about is kind of what I see as her overall takeaway, and when we asked her why this conversation is so important. And I think you even said, you were like, wow, that was surprising, when she was like, well, the overall takeaway is love. This is why we do this. And I was like, wow, okay, yes, I get that. And I love that she just brought that back to this sort of that heart space. But then why is it love actually? And I think, so putting this together, after sort of stewing this and steeping in this, Sloane spoke about where C.A.R.E works to deal with people individually. And when we do that in spaces like animal welfare, we hear people talk about love for their animals, and it takes you right to that heart space. And that immediately is something we can all resonate with. And that leads to a sense of connection, which takes us into this human space. It takes us to our humanity, and then an equal playing field, equity, right? And I feel like when I was doing my dog collar business, just as a side note, this was where I was on the ground selling and doing markets and shows. And every time someone would come, I'd be like, hi, how are you? What kind of dog do you have? And the next question was always, how did you find each other? And immediately, it didn't matter who I was or who they were, or our projections of each other, went right to the heart space, and their faces lit up. It was this warm, beautiful connection. And it took us right to this beautiful story of how they found their animal. And
right. And I think the thing about equity in that, what I hear in that is that when we're connecting and something that we both have a shared knowledge of, we are on a level playing field. We don't put ourselves ones above. It doesn't matter how much money they make. It doesn't matter how much education they have. It doesn't matter what their, socioeconomic, any of that. It's the space where we all know exactly what the other person's talking about, because we've experienced it. It's a shared experience that brings that level playing field.
That's exactly right. And it resonates, right? And everything else falls away. And all we're left with is our humanity. That I'm a human and you're a human, and we all love our animals. And I think... And how we're more the same than different. That's the other thing. Exactly.
That's the other thing. It's all of a sudden it melts, it softens, and it's like, oh, we're actually more the same than we are different.
That's
you know
right.
Exactly what I'm talking about.
Because we are all the same. I mean, that's the truth.
But it's and it's just it's a fast way in.
Yes,
to
it's
that.
A fast way in. And however, though, I will say, not all of our experiences are the same. And so from this space
not
of
at all,
love,
right?
Yeah. So today, from as C.A.R.E leading us and opening up these new intersections for us to spend time with, from there, we can partner in animal welfare. We can defer to communities in context to environmental justice. And we can stand next to and behind those that are living and working in communities that know best the BIPOC experience, and support the creation of spaces that offer social justice for people and their animals. And that's when we can change the narrative. And C.A.R.E is about changing the narrative. And I think this is where, if we can connect through understanding, education, listening, all of these things, this is where we can actually change the experience today.
Mhm.
And, we talked about generational trauma. That's part of this conversation. We talked about all the things. And I think for me, ultimately, it's not just partnering. It's not just working with, it's also, can we be a disruptor? And I think that's where it's like disrupting what this cycle that's in repeat over and over again. And then how do we partner within the communities of these experiences? And I see C.A.R.E like a beautiful, sorry, this is where I can't handle it anymore. I'll just edit this out. But this is true for me. So I see C.A.R.E like a beautiful rose vine working its way through pillars of institutions that have been built on inequity and social injustice, and breaking apart the structure and creating a space to bloom. And all for the love of people and their sweet baby animal companions. And again, it just comes back to, from a kindred perspective, our deep love of animals and nature. And I hate inequity. I hate unfairness. And this is where we are going to keep doing our work to be a partner, creating a space for voices, and as much as we can through this podcast in our communities and in our homes, create new narratives and new language. So thank you to C.A.R.E and thank you to Sloane. She was an absolute trooper through this and just leading us.
Yeah, she really was. Yeah. And she just really, I mean, like you said in the intro, there were some big questions, and she didn't shy away from any of them. She was just like, yep, okay, let's start with this. And she just slogged through. I mean, just the way that she could do that. I mean, I was really, really, she knows what she's talking about, and she did a really eloquent job of speaking to all that stuff.
She did. Eloquence, and loves her research, which we do too. I mean, this is what we want, just the facts, ma'am. So please follow C.A.R.E on Instagram at C.A.R.E for Equity, and spend some time on their website, careawo.org, for great information. And that video that I was talking about in the interview, it's really, it's a beautiful video. And as always, you can find all links and show notes on our website, kindredpodcast.co, and follow our podcast wherever you listen. Your support really helps boost our visibility in search settings, and it allows more listeners to discover us and hear episodes like today, which are just so critical. And please rate and review us. Your feedback, as always, means the world to us, and we really love hearing from you. So, all right, good people. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Sloane. Thank you, Jen, for co-hosting, and the whole Kindred team. Lots of love. Kindred is hosted by me and my sister Jen, produced by Kat Gaddy and myself, sound production and editing by Dan Cooper, original music by Ellie Grace, and our Kindred artwork was created by Lindsay Coffin. Please follow, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and feel free to contact us through our website at kindredpodcast.co, where you can also find details about Kindred Plus, our subscription service, as well as links to our social media accounts and show notes.